something strange you'll see all over the old towns of England if you bother to look up at the walls. A window, but it has no glass, no frame. Inside it, there's just brick, filled in neatly from one edge to the other. It isn't because the house is abandoned. It isn't bomb damage or decay. Look closely, and you'll see the brickwork sealing it is tidy, deliberate, solid. Someone spent the effort, spent the money, hired a mason, and had them wall up a perfectly good window on their own house. Walk a little further, and the house next door has one too. Then a whole terrace of them. In the city of Bath, honey-colored Georgian houses stand shoulder to shoulder, and every few doors there's a window that's been filled in. Across Britain, right up to today, thousands of windows like these sit silent, bricked over for nearly 200 years, never once opened again. The question is almost annoyingly simple. Why would an ordinary person wall up the light and the air in their own home? The answer isn't a sentence. It's a chain, a policy blunder that ran for 155 years, a cat-and-mouse game between a government and its people, a tax that reshaped the architecture of an entire nation, and along the way, quietly pushed more than a few people toward their deaths. But to understand why the English bricked up their windows, we have to go back a little further first, to a tax that was even uglier. A tax so hated that people didn't just brick up windows to dodge it, they bricked up their own fireplaces. Go back to 1662. England has just come through a civil war and restored its monarchy. King Charles II sits on the throne with an empty treasury and an expensive court. Parliament calculates that the crown needs an enormous sum every year just to function, and the money simply isn't there. They need a new tax, and they need it fast. The idea they land on sounds a lot like the one that will appear 34 years later. Tax people by their hearths. The logic of the age. A richer house has more rooms. More rooms means more fireplaces. So counting fireplaces is a way to measure wealth without ever asking about income. Every hearth, every stove in the house is charged 2 shillings a year. It's called the hearth tax, or as ordinary people bluntly named it, the chimney tax. It sounds reasonable enough, but there's one fatal flaw, and it isn't in the numbers. It's in how the tax gets collected. To count the hearths in a house, the tax officials have to come inside. They have to walk through your door, move through your rooms, peer into every kitchen and bedchamber to count the chimneys. The men who did this were known, with real contempt, as the chimney men. And the idea that a stranger, acting in the king's name, had the right to march straight into your private rooms and rummage through your home was, to a 17th century Englishman, an intolerable insult. The resentment ran so deep that when the tax was finally repealed, the official act itself recorded a line that still bites when you read it today. It called the hearth tax not just a burden on the poor, but a badge of slavery upon the whole people, exposing every man's house to be entered into and searched at pleasure by men he'd never met. And people didn't just resent it, they fought back. They barred their doors against the collectors. And here's the detail that foretells everything to come. To dodge the hearth tax, many people bricked up their own fireplaces, hiding them, so that when the chimney man arrived to count, the room looked as though it had never had a hearth at all. Human beings, when you tax a thing, will always find a way to make that thing disappear from view. The lesson was already right there in 1662. Nobody learned it. In 1689, a new reign began. King William III and Queen Mary, and one of the first things they did to win the people's favor was abolish the hearth tax. The whole country breathed out. That vile, intrusive tax was finally dead. But the relief was short-lived, because the Treasury had just lost a major source of revenue, and within a few years, this same king who scrapped the hearth tax would fall into a money crisis even worse than before. He would need cash, urgently, and a new tax to raise it. The question hanging over the entire kingdom was this. This time, what on earth were they going to tax? William's crisis began somewhere that sounds bizarre to modern ears. The country's money was literally being shaved away. In those days, coins were struck from real silver, and a coin's value lay in the silver it contained. But that very fact created a lucrative trick. Fraudsters would quietly use shears or a file to clip a thin rim of silver from the edge of each coin, then push the trimmed coin back into circulation. The slivers were collected, melted down, and sold. Each coin lost only a little, but multiplied across millions of coins running through the kingdom, the entire currency was silently, catastrophically losing its value. By the mid-1690s, many circulating silver coins had been clipped down to roughly half the weight they were supposed to carry. Faith in money itself was collapsing. The state was forced into something enormously expensive: recall every old coin and remint the whole lot from scratch. A vast operation later known as the Great Recoinage of 1696. And the man handed the job of overseeing the royal mint through this crisis, believe it or not, was Isaac Newton. Yes, that Newton, of gravity and mathematics. In 1696 he was appointed Warden of the Mint, and he did the job with a frightening seriousness, personally hunting down, investigating, and prosecuting the clippers and counterfeiters. Newton haunted the seedy taverns of London in disguise, gathering testimony, building cases. The most notorious forger he sent to the gallows was a man named William Challoner, so brazen he had actually mocked the mint and demanded to be let in to reform it. The greatest scientist of the age, it turns out, was also a relentless hunter of currency criminals. But reminting an entire nation's money costs money, a great deal of it, and the treasury was running dry, having just lost the hearth tax revenue on top of everything. William needed a new tax, immediately. And here, the problem turned tricky in a way that was very particular to the age. He could not tax income. To us today, an income tax is a matter of course. But to a 17th century Englishman, the idea of having to declare how much you earned to the government was an unacceptable invasion. Force a man to open his books, to lay his private wealth bare before a tax official? Never. And more to the point, the government had just abolished the hearth tax precisely because it was intrusive, precisely because the chimneymen barged into people's homes. To now invent a new tax that pried into private affairs would be to walk straight back into the trap they'd just escaped. So the question became a genuine puzzle. How do you tax a person according to their wealth, without ever setting foot in their house, without asking a single question about their money? And someone found an answer so ingenious that it passed almost instantly, before anyone had time to see the disaster hidden inside it. The answer was this: stop counting hearths inside the house, count the windows instead. The logic kept the old spirit. Rich people live in big houses. Big houses have many windows, so the number of windows is a measure of wealth. But the clever part, the part that got this idea praised as brilliant, lay somewhere else entirely. You can count a house's windows without setting a single toe inside it. The tax official just stands out in the street, looks up, and counts. No knocking, no rummaging, no invading anyone's private rooms. If the hated hearth collectors were called chimneymen, the men who counted windows just stood on the pavement and peered upward, and they earned a far gentler nickname, the window peepers. Same goal, collecting money, but one kind of man forces his way into your house, and the other just stands in the road. Politically, that difference was the whole world. So in 1696, under William III, the window tax was born, tucked inside an act with a long-winded name about making good the silver that had been clipped out of the nation's coins. The early rates were fairly light. Each house paid a flat charge. Houses above a certain number of windows paid an extra sum on top, and the more windows, the higher the band. For a small cottage with a few windows, the tax was almost nothing. But for a country mansion with 30 or 40 windows, this was a steady, meaningful expense every year. On paper, it was close to a perfect tax. It was progressive. The rich in big houses paid more, the poor in small houses paid little or nothing. It was discreet. No one had to declare their income. It was easy to collect. Just stand in the street and count. Even the economic thinkers of the day considered it an improvement on the hearth tax. But there was one thing no act of parliament, no stroke of genius could design around: human behavior. Because the rule that had already shown itself under the hearth tax, the rule that people will make the taxed thing disappear, hadn't gone anywhere. It was simply waiting. And all across England, people began to look up at their own walls, count their windows one by one, and realize something cold. Every window, from this day on, was a debt. So what would they do with all those debts hanging on their walls? The solution was obvious, to the point of being painful. Exactly the way people had once bricked up hearths to dodge the chimney tax. If your 11th window pushed your house into a higher tax band, then brick it up. Hire a mason, fill it in with brick, and the house dropped to a lower band. The bill got lighter. This is the origin of the filled-in windows you see all over England today. They aren't broken windows. They're financial decisions frozen into brick and stone, standing exactly where they were left for centuries. But the story doesn't stop at bricking up a window once. Because this was a cat-and-mouse game, and the state was never willing to be the mouse. Every time England needed money, and throughout the 18th century it constantly needed money to fund one war after another, the government would crank the window tax up another notch. Between 1747 and 1808 alone, the window tax was raised 6 separate times. The tax structure was also tightened into something more cunning. From 1747, on top of the flat 2 shillings per house, the window portion was banded clearly. A house with 10 to 14 windows paid 6p per window, a house with 15 to 19 paid 9p per window, and a house with 20 or more paid a full shilling for every single one. Which meant you weren't just penalized for having windows. Each extra window dragged up the price of all the others. Cross a single threshold, and the whole house jumped into a more expensive bracket. 2 moments stand out. In 1784, Prime Minister William Pitt sharply raised the window tax to make up for a cut he'd just made to the tax on tea. The result was recorded flatly in the parliamentary record. Owners in both town and country began to their houses by blocking up their windows. But the heaviest blow came in 1797, when Pitt brought in an act tripling the rates to pay for the war with France. And the parliamentary record describes a scene that's almost hard to believe. The very day after the act took effect, thousands of windows across England were bricked shut. In their fury, people chalked onto the freshly bricked spaces a parody of a prayer: "Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee." A whole nation, in a single night, chose darkness over the tax. Then, in the 1820s, the state made a move that changed the very nature of the game. They lowered the threshold to just 8 windows. It sounds small, but the consequence was enormous, because before, the window tax mostly touched the comfortable, the people with large houses. Now the 8-window line reached straight into the homes of the lower middle class and the working poor. Overnight, a tax on the rich became a tax that pressed down on the backs of the poor, and people stopped waiting until they had to brick things up. Builders began designing new houses with as few windows as possible from the very first brick laid. Whole blocks of workers' housing in the industrial cities went up with rooms that had almost no windows at all, entirely on purpose, just to sit beneath the tax threshold. But here, the story reaches a genuinely absurd stretch that's hard to believe is real, because the law had made one ridiculous mistake. It never clearly defined what a window actually was. And when the law leaves a gap like that, officials are free to interpret it however best fills the treasury. The parliamentary record of 1848 preserves cases that make you laugh and wince at once. A Cambridge professor was taxed for a hole in the wall of his coal cellar simply because that hole let in some light. A man in Westminster had to pay tax on a trapdoor down to his cellar. It was said that if a single brick fell out of a wall and let a beam of light through, you had, in theory, gained a taxable window, and that could push your whole house up a band, making every other window more expensive. And in the meantime, while a hole in a poor man's cellar wall counted as a taxable window, list of things that were exempt read like a patchwork of contradictions. Government offices were exempt, farmhouses below a certain rental value were exempt, and so were dairies, cheese rooms, malt houses, granaries, and coachmakers' workshops. A system where the poor man's air hole got billed and a tradesman's entire workshop got a pass. Imagine living under that anxiety. A single loose brick could become a tax bill. What safer option than to seal everything up? And when an entire country starts sealing up every opening for light, something inside those walls begins to die. To understand how this clever tax turned into a killing machine, you have to look at where it did the most damage: the cities. In the cities, large houses were often carved up into multiple apartments rented out to poor families, but the law counted that whole building as a single taxable unit. What did that mean? It meant that if a building held 2 apartments, each with 6 windows, the state didn't see 2 6-window homes. It added them up into 12 windows on one bill, shoving the building into a high band and dropping that whole burden onto the poorest people in it. How did landlords respond? Simply, brick up some of the windows. The one who paid the price wasn't the landlord, it was the tenants, the families locked away in the dark, so the landlord could save a few shillings. The numbers show just how completely the injustice had flipped from its original intent. According to debates in Parliament, in London the window tax could swallow up to roughly 30% of the rent on smaller houses, and on some streets it climbed to 40 or 50%. Meanwhile, on the great mansions of the wealthy, the same tax typically came to under 5% of rental value. A tax born to make the rich pay more ended up strangling the poor and all but letting the rich walk free. But money was only half the price. The other half was paid in lives. In the 19th century, light and clean air weren't decoration. They were survival. A room with its windows bricked shut was a damp, stagnant room. No draft, no sunlight to kill germs. And in rooms like that, disease bred. Typhus, cholera, smallpox moved through the very spaces people had sealed up to dodge the tax. There were outbreaks that swept through bricked-up dwellings and carried off dozens of lives at once, and the deeper cause traced back to one place: no ventilation, no light. People began to call it by a bitter name, the tax on light and air, as though the state were selling you back the very thing the sky gave for free. The anger reached the intellectuals and the writers. The great novelist Charles Dickens, in the preface to his novel David Copperfield, published in 1850, attacked this tax directly, condemning it as a tax on light and air. Building trade journals ran editorials against it, and more doctors began to speak up, carrying cold clinical evidence. This tax was directly shortening people's lives. In desperation, people even came up with a response both comical and heartbreaking. If you couldn't have a real window, then paint a fake one onto the brick wall. A technique of visual illusion called trompe-l'œil, French for deceive the eye, was used to paint onto the wall fake frames, fake panes, even fake curtains that looked real from a distance. It made the house a little less bleak, a little less humiliating. But of course, a window painted in oils never let in a single ray of sun. And this was an age with no electric light. When the sun went down, inside those rooms there was absolute darkness. And here we reach a story that almost everyone who talks about the window tax repeats. And I want to stop, because it's a beautiful trap. People usually tell it like this. The English phrase, daylight robbery, used today to mean being ripped off outrageously, was supposedly born from the window tax. The story sounds perfect. The government was robbing people of their daylight, so the people coined the phrase to curse it. The logic fits so tightly, you almost want to believe it on the spot. And that is exactly why you should be careful, because it's almost certainly not true. There's no scholarly evidence connecting the phrase daylight robbery to the window tax at all. In fact, the phrase only appears in print, with its robbery meaning, in the early 20th century, which is more than half a century after the window tax was already abolished. If it had really been born out of the fury over the window tax, we'd expect to find traces of it back in the 18th or early 19th century, right when people were bricking up windows and chalking curses at Pitt on their walls. But through that entire period, the phrase is nowhere to be found. This is a textbook example of how a story that's too good not to believe spreads itself down through the generations, repeated in one article after another, one book after the next, until everyone knows it's true and nobody has checked. It teaches a useful lesson. Sometimes the detail that sounds the most logical, the one that fits the story most neatly, is exactly the one you should trust the least. And if daylight robbery is one myth worth dismantling, there's another, just as common, that you need to know before you walk out onto the street and start reading old walls for yourself. Say tomorrow you walk past an old building and see a window filled in with brick. It's very easy to blurt out, "Ah, window tax dodge," right there. But hold on, not every bricked-up window is a scar left by that tax. Because for centuries before the window tax existed, going all the way back to the medieval period, architects deliberately built fake windows, known as blind windows or blank windows. The reason was purely aesthetic. A handsome facade needs symmetry. The windows should line up in straight, even rows, balanced on both sides. But sometimes behind a spot on the wall there's a staircase, a chimney flue, or a dividing wall, and a real window can't go there. To keep the whole facade from breaking rhythm, they'd build a false window to keep the row aligned. This kind of blind window is ancient. You can find blank windows built purely for decoration on structures going back as far as the 8th century. So how do you tell an aesthetic blind window from one that was bricked up for tax? Actually, if you look closely, it's fairly easy. An aesthetic blind window was designed in from the start. Its frame is neat and fully detailed, the infill sits flush and even within it, and most importantly, it fits the whole order of the facade in perfect rhythm. It looks like it always belonged there. A tax-bricked window is the opposite. It's a later patch job. The infill brick is usually rougher than the surrounding wall. The mortar color doesn't quite match, and it breaks the symmetry of the wall, because it was never in the original design. One is the architect's intention from the first page of the drawings. The other is the scar of a financial decision stamped onto a building that was already complete. In other words, every tax-bricked window is a frozen moment of history, the exact day someone sat down, did the math, and chose darkness to keep a few coins. But a whole nation can't live in the dark forever. The pressure had been building for a century and a half, and at last it had to break. By the mid-19th century, the balance began to tip. England was industrializing fiercely. People poured from the countryside into the cities, crammed into housing that was ever more crowded, ever darker, ever more disease-ridden, and part of the direct cause was a tax that made people brick up their windows. At the same time, the public health reform movement was rising, after a landmark Public Health Act was passed, stressing the role of light and ventilation in fighting disease. A tax that ran directly against those very principles grew more and more absurd and impossible to justify. The doctors mounted a relentless campaign. A group of London physicians petitioned Parliament, armed with specific clinical examples, arguing that this tax was directly killing people by forcing families to live in darkness and stagnant air. The press attacked. Public opinion boiled. The fight in Parliament went right down to the wire. A motion to repeal the window tax was once defeated by just 3 votes in April of 1850. 3 votes. But the pressure never let up. Through the winter of 1850 into 1851, the wave demanding repeal rose across the whole country. And there's a less romantic truth that was helping kill it too. The tax was dying of its own avoidance. The more windows got bricked up, the more houses were built without them, the more the revenue shrank. Income from the window tax had fallen from roughly £1,900,000 at the start of the century to around £1.5 million by the 1840s. A tax that was harmful, hated, and bringing in less and less, had almost no reason left to survive. And here's a detail that makes the whole thing more bitter still. England wasn't even where this tax lived longest. The idea of taxing light had spread across Europe. France built its own version, a tax on both doors and windows, beginning in 1798, in the years after its revolution. And while the English managed to scrap their tax in 1851, in France, the tax on doors and windows kept going, squeezing the fronts of houses, right up until 1926. Which means there were French citizens who lived through the First World War still being taxed for having windows. Finally, on the 24th of July, 1851, after 155 years, the window tax was formally abolished in England and Wales. The window taxes in Scotland and Ireland were scrapped at the same time. It was replaced by a tax based on the rental value of a house, a far fairer measure, and crucially, one that no longer punished you for having windows. But England was never recast whole. All across the country, from the Georgian terraces of Bath to countless old villages and towns, thousands of windows still sit there, bricked over, silent, hundreds of years after the tax that created them died. Many were never reopened, some because the cost of knocking out the brick, cutting a new opening, and fitting glass was too high. Some simply because people had grown so used to the house's one-eyed face that they no longer saw it as missing anything. So the next time you walk past an old stone wall and catch sight of a window filled in with brick, remember that you're not looking at a broken window. You're looking at a fossil, the frozen trace of the day a whole nation was forced to choose between light and money, and, given their circumstances, chose money. A tax, designed to strike at wealth, ended up striking at sunlight. An idea that sounded so clever it passed instantly on paper, turned into brick, into darkness, and into disease in the real world. From a hearth tax that made people brick up their hearths, to a window tax that made people brick up their windows, history repeated the exact same lesson that no one would learn. And maybe that's the biggest thing those bricked-up windows leave us with. Not a story about England, about King William, or about Pitt, but a cold rule about human beings themselves. When you tax a thing, people will always find a way to have less of it, even when the thing is daylight.